What's going on, listeners? This is episode 2 of the BLC, the Bigfoot Legends Connections podcast. Before we hit the intro, just wanted to let everyone know that tonight's episode will be focusing a bit more on, like I said from the last episode, phase 2, which was my curiosity phase, where I was asking people if they had any Bigfoot stories. I have at least a solid 3 that I'm going to be telling you this episode.
So my question for all the Bigfoot believers and skeptics alike is this. How do you reconcile the fact that literally every culture in the world today has legends and connections to the creature we often refer to as Bigfoot, dating back to the dawn of time? Is this just coincidence, or is it something more? Why do all the stories contain the same recurring descriptions and themes? Whether they call them Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, Yeren, Skunk Ape, Yowie, or some other name, the reports are all the same. From America to China, the Himalayas to Australia, literally every continent has the same phenomenon. Why do we see such similarities? How could this story permeate throughout the entire globe? Is there definitive proof of the existence of Bigfoot? That's what I'm on a mission to figure out. Join me as we uncover the stories, the evidences, and the unbelievable yet true events that have occurred all throughout the world. My goal is to turn skeptics into believers, and believers into knowers. I'm Riley Woolner, and welcome to the Bigfoot Legends and Connections podcast.
Alright, so last episode I introduced everyone to who I was, how I got interested in the topic of Sasquatch. Let them know that I had heard a handful of stories from people who I felt were credible that claimed to have had experiences with the Bigfoot creatures. And after that, I got very curious and did my best to be discretionary, but would ask people if they had had any sort of experiences themselves or knew someone who had experiences with these Sasquatch creatures. And I'm going to tell you 3 different stories from people who I met along this journey. So the first one was another ferry worker. I believe he was actually on a day that Scott was sick. He came in as sort of a replacement for him to be the ferry captain. His name was Tim. And Tim, I only was able to interact with that one day. And this is this was in August in Oregon of 2018, and there was a truck on the ferry that had a Bigfoot sticker on the back, and I used that as the sort of conversation starter and asked Tim. And by the way, Tim was probably in his mid-50s and had been working for the Oregon state government for most of his career. And I asked him, "Hey, Tim, what do you think about the whole Bigfoot thing when we saw that on the back of the truck? Do you think that, Bigfoot might be real?" And he was like, "How much time you got, Riley?" I, jokingly responded, "Well, you know how long my shift is. I'm here for a while with you." And he was a nice guy, and he told me, "Well, let me tell you something. I have not seen a Bigfoot myself, but my son has." And I was, curious and asked, "All right, well, you mind telling me the story?" And he told me his son's name is Austin, and that one time, this was only a few years back, so this was probably in 2015. He said that they went for a hike around there's a little ghost town called Valsetz. And I should clarify, it's more like the remains of a ghost town. There's really not much up there. I've been there since. And he told me that to get up to this ghost town, you've got to drive quite a ways. And I'm actually familiar with where this is now. So you have Salem, Oregon, which is Oregon's capital. For those who aren't familiar with that, Portland is the biggest city, but it's actually not Oregon's capital. Salem is. So a little bit southwest of Salem, there's the city of Dallas. That's actually the small city that I grew up in. And then if you go from there, there's a even smaller little town called Falls City. And Falls City is just a dot on the map, but there is something that is really famous in Falls City called Black Rock mountain biking. And Black Rock is apparently a sort of a mountain biking mecca here in the United States. A lot of people have actually come from around the country to come to Black Rock, and it's a really cool area. It like I said in the last episode, Oregon is extremely forested, and you've got all of these wooden ramps that have been made that kind of weave in and out of these trees, these giant Douglas firs that just cover this part of Oregon, and you can go mountain biking along these wooden ramps, and it just feels really cool. I've been mountain biking there myself once, and it was a lot of fun. So beyond Falls City, even past there, you have to drive another hour and a half to 2 hours to get up to this, like I said, the remains of this ghost town called Valsetz. And Tim claimed that him and his son Austin went hiking up there around that area, and his memory is one of saying he had to use the bathroom, as guys do out in the forest, and his son Austin, who was probably close to my age at the time, in his early 20s, Tim said that Austin just kept on hiking along and went around the corner. And I believe that Tim said that he had gotten a phone call or a text, and so after going to the bathroom, he stayed behind a little bit to answer that call. And so Austin had gone a decent ways ahead, and Austin had just kept on walking. So as Tim ended the phone call and started walking as he kept on going down the rest of the trail, he remembers seeing his son running back around the corner and yelling for Tim, to turn around and run back to the car. And Tim, of course, seeing that his son was extremely scared, didn't really doubt any reason why his son was running, and he decided to turn around and book it back to their car. And as they got in, his son told him to turn on the engine and to get out of there. So they peeled on out of that area, and by the time they got down to about a half an hour down the road, Austin finally wanted to talk, and Tim asked what in the world happened. And Austin's story was this. Austin says that as he was hiking around that corner and he kept on going, there's a really big oak tree that had fallen over the trail, but that its branches made it elevated so that way the part that was over the trail was able to be walked under. Apparently some of the park rangers had come by and sawn off the branches. Instead of moving the entire tree, they just sawed the branches off so you could walk under it. But you still had plenty of the tree extending off into the forest, and that was where sort of the roots of the tree were. And it kind of went across but sort of paralleled the trail. So as you're walking, you are going under it, but you're also kind of following along. And as Austin is going under this tree, he starts to feel it wobble on top of him. And it was a wobbling to the point where he kind of could feel and tell that someone was walking along it, making it kind of bounce. And he assumed it must have been his dad who had caught up to him, and he thought it was gonna be probably his dad trying to give him a scare or something, something funny. And as he comes out to the other side of this tree and is a few paces away from the tree, he turns around, preparing to see his dad, and instead of seeing his dad, he saw this lean, man-shaped being covered in hair that was walking on top of this tree and had gotten to a point in the middle of the tree that's in the trail where it was looking down at Austin. And Austin says that the thing jumped off from the tree, and as it fell onto the ground on its 2 feet, it made barely any sound at all. And as it did this, Austin is paralyzed with the fear of the unknown, and this thing looked to be, according to Austin, not as big as your typical Bigfoot story will describe the creature to be. He said that this Bigfoot was probably around 6'7", 6'8", and that it looked at Austin, gave him a smile, almost like a smirk, and then trotted off into the ferns that led off into the forest. And Austin, understandably, was extremely freaked out, ran back the way he had come because he had no desire to keep on hiking in that direction with whatever this thing was out there. Found his dad, told him to run back to the car, and that was how they got back to back down through Falls City, down into Dallas, back out to Salem. And Tim said that he didn't want to disbelieve his son, but he just felt so skeptical of the whole encounter. And so he claims that they jumped on the computer and he tried looking up, a few different monkeys and a bear, and asked his son, "Is this what you saw? Is this what you saw?" And his son kept on saying, No, that's not what I saw. And finally they came across the Patterson-Gimlin still frame, the typical and most iconic Bigfoot image that most people are familiar with, where you can see Patty, as she's come to be known, with her arms swinging and her, maybe not so obvious to some, but quite obvious to others, her female anatomy, as well as the sort of braid on the back of her head. That stereotypical Bigfoot image was what Austin paused on and said, "Dad, that is what I saw. Except it wasn't that big and bulky. This one was more lean. But that's what I saw. That's what its face looked like." And at that moment, Tim believed his son. And from then on, he kind of always, Austin kind of always avoided that part of Oregon, and kind of was a little more shy of the wilderness since that experience. So that was Tim's story to me. He told me to he told me that I was free to believe or not, but that was his son's story and that he believed his son. So for me, that was once again another tale on the ferry that absolutely intrigued me. So some time went by, never really felt like I met anyone that I would want to broach the subject with, until I was out in Idaho for college. I went to BYU, Idaho, formerly known as Ricks College. And BYU, Idaho is in eastern Idaho, or southeastern Idaho, if you're kind of looking at, depends on how you're sort of describing Idaho. But it's an area that's very snowy and cold during the winter, and warm and a lot of fun during the summer. So this next story takes place in the wintertime, and I want to say it was around February, and around this time of year, you're looking at feet of snow, or in pretty much any given direction, and that part of Idaho, you get snow for probably about 4 to 5, maybe sometimes even 6 months of the year. And I was an early morning custodian at the school, and this job was one that I would have to wake up for and get up to the school from my apartment, which is only about 5-10 minutes away. Be up there by 4 in the morning, and we would work from around 4 to 6 or 7. And that was my kind of part-time job while going to school. And while I was up there, one of my buddies named Brian, who I didn't know super well, but I remember him being really into metal music. He was pretty sarcastic, pretty funny guy, and he was one of the other custodians up there. And I asked him how his weekend was, and he said, "Oh man, I'm exhausted." And I was like, "Oh yeah, what did you have a long weekend?" And he said, "Well, I just barely got here." And I was like, "You just barely got here? Like, were you driving through the night or something?" Because it was a Monday morning. And he's like, "Yeah, I went down to Ogden, Utah, to hang out with my cousin who lives down there, and we just decided to stay up all night and then drive here." And he told me that his cousin was staying with him, gonna be hanging with him throughout that week up in Idaho where we were. So he got kind of quiet and then said, "Dude, something really weird kind of just happened while we were driving." And I was like, "Oh yeah, what's that?" And he didn't know that I had an interest in this subject, by the way, for those who, might be wondering if he just made up a fun story to see what the Bigfoot guy has to say about it. He didn't know anything about me having this interest. He just said, "I had this really weird experience just like honestly a few hours ago around like 2 in the morning. Me and my cousin were driving up through, driving up from Ogden." And for those who aren't familiar with the geography of southern Idaho and northern Utah, you're amidst the Rocky Mountains, but most of the sort of land between the border there is a lot of plains and prairie, and mostly sagebrush, and at this time of the year, snow, some smaller hills, and some farmland. So basically, other than the highway, you're out in the middle of nothing. And Brian says that as they were driving along this highway, it's 2 o'clock at night. It's pitch black out, and it's currently snowing. And everyone who's spent a lot of time in the snow, especially at night when you have your headlights on, it gives you this sort of this cool effect that looks like when you go into hyperspace in Star Wars movies, where the snow is just blowing right towards your windshield. Anyways, just trying to give you a bit of a visual on what this experience was like. So as they're driving along, they spot someone on the side of the road, and they're, like I said, in the middle of nothing, and they're both look at each other like, "What in the world? Who's out here at 2 in the morning and in the middle of the snow?" And as they get closer, they realize, man, that guy's tall. He looks like a NBA player. He's so tall. As they get closer, they wonder if it's a black guy, an African American guy, who's got no clothes on, because they could tell that he was dark, and they could very much see the shape of this man's body. And then they get even closer, within just like a few feet, and because at this point they're thinking maybe this guy needs a ride somewhere, and they could give him some help if he needs it. And as they got closer, within a few feet of him, they realize Brian says it almost looked like he had like a skin tight fur coat like around his body, because it was the only thing that kind of made sense. He even said that he's like, "I thought it kind of looked like one of those like like he had something in his hoodie, or like in the hood of the hat had something kind of poking out at the back or whatever, because he said that the head of this guy almost looked conical in a weird shape. Not like a straight up cone or anything, but just a little bit more elongated in some way. And as this man turned around, they realized very quickly it wasn't, well, all he said was that he had a very strange looking face. And it was a strange enough looking face that it kind of unnerved them. And already the situation was just kind of weird, and Brian says his cousin just floored it, and they kept on driving. And both of them kind of just were weirded out after that situation. And I looked at him after he told me that story, and I said, dude, I'm pretty sure you guys ran into a Sasquatch. And he looks at me and he says, a Sasquatch? I was like, yeah, like a Bigfoot. And he says, what? And then I could see the hamster wheel turning, and he looks at me and looks at the ground and looks at me, and then he said, huh, yeah, you know what, that might have been it. Because I told him, I was like, I really highly doubt there's just some random homeless man who was, because I asked him how tall he was, and he's like, oh, he had to be at least like 6'10", 6'11", maybe 7'2". And I told him, I was like, you really think there was some 7'2" guy out wandering in the snow at 2 a.m. with no clothes on, out in the middle of out in the middle of no man's land, Idaho, Utah? And he just, looked at me and said, you got a point. Maybe we saw Bigfoot. So that was the second time that I had, within a short, within this, that was the first time while up at BYU, Idaho, that I remember asking or hearing about a story from someone that had to do with this subject. One where I felt like I think there was some legitimacy to that. So then the third and last story is coming from, now, for those who aren't familiar, BYU, Idaho is a college that is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So it's a school owned by the church, and therefore in the school we call our professors brother or sister. So Brother Remington was one of my religion course teachers, and he was just awesome. Total cowboy. He was from Shelley, Idaho, which, for those who aren't familiar with Idaho, it's in eastern Idaho. It's a small little country town, and he's the kind of cowboy who's legitimately, he's going into rodeos. He'd jump off of horses to tie down calves, and he would always carry like tools and big chains and things like that to help people out of snow whenever they needed it. And he was just a real stud of a guy. And at the end of the year of that, or at the end of that semester, he would always bring people out for, he would bring people into his office, each one of us, and kind of just have an interview and be like, hey, how'd the semester go? Or how are you looking for finals? Do you need any help? And while we were in there, I decided to venture my curiosity and just ask him. I said, hey, Brother Remington, you've spent a lot of time outside. You're a real outdoorsy kind of guy. You have, from what I understood, he had quite a bit of farmland that he actively took care of during the summer months when he wasn't teaching. And I just said, you know what, you spend a lot of time outside. I'm curious, what do you think, or what do you know about the whole Sasquatch phenomenon? And he said, he kind of got quiet, and I thought, oh boy, I'm going to be told not to believe in such silliness or something like that. After all, he was a religion teacher. And he just looked at me and said, you know what, Riley, I actually have a story for you. And I was like, all excited at this point. Okay, I said, okay, yeah, I want to hear it. And he said, this last summer, so this was probably 2019, so the time he's talking about. So the summer of 2019 in Shelley, Idaho, he told me that he's like, this last summer I was working out at my place there in Shelley, and I had hired a bunch of guys to lay down some what do you call it, some piping, some irrigation piping on my property, on my farmland, for some of the crops that he was going to be tending. And he claims that one day, he says, I was driving on my property and came around the corner to where all of the guys were working, and I see them all scattering, all of them just running around trying to get in their trucks. And I get out of my truck and I go up to one of them and I say, hey, what's going on? And I hear them all yelling, monstro, monstro, which is, he said, I don't speak Spanish, but I could tell what monstro meant. And he's like, what's going on? And he said, one of the guys said that, sorry, boss, like, we can't work for the rest of the day. Like, we're out of here. And he's like, what happened? Why? And he's like, we're all leaving because we were just working, and we're all in the, working down the line, and all of a sudden we heard this really loud noise coming from the forest, and this something comes barreling out of the forest, and it starts running towards us, and it was covered in hair. It was big and tall, and it even got so close to one of the guys that he had to start running away from it, and then it jumped over the ditch that they'd been digging, the ditch we were digging, and it jumped over that and then ran off into the other side of your property in the forest. He's like, we're out of here, and there was nothing that Brother Remington could do, and he just had to let them all go, and he ended up calling them, and within a week or so, he finally got most of them to come back and continue working. And he just looked at me and he said, make of you will with that. But honestly, like, that was something that happened, and I can't imagine why they would lie about that. I mean, he's like, it's a pretty creative way to get a day off, I guess. But he's like, these guys were shook up, man. They were scared, and I had never heard of anything like that on my property up to that point, and they all were claiming to have seen it. And he's like, I don't know. I feel like if it was one guy, I might not believe him, but the fact that there were like at least 12 guys who all saw the same thing and they all describe it too, he's like, I feel like what they saw was real. So after that conversation with Brother Remington, I was getting to a point where I felt like, all right, I have now 6 different stories of people I know who, whether they interacted it with them themselves or at least have someone else who's close to them who's interacted with it, they all sound to me like credible stories from credible people who aren't trying to get attention, who, they haven't reported these things to the BFRO. For those who aren't familiar with that, that's sort of the one of the official sites you can report your encounter to. None of them had been on the news or anything. These were all just their own personal stories that they all had in regards to what can only be described as Bigfoot. And at this point as well, I started listening to Sasquatch Chronicles, which is an awesome podcast as well. If you're interested in this subject, it can be found on Spotify. I started listening to that and started just exposing myself to all of the strangeness and all of the excitement that is the Bigfoot topic. And I came to realize something, that this many people can't be misidentifying another animal. this many people can't be simply liars. This many people can't be all hallucinating. These are real experiences, and for me, it was compelling. It was something that made me want to continue to pursue my interest in the topic, and it made me want to get out there more. I already was a pretty outdoorsy guy. I grew up liking to go hiking, longboarding, surfing, biking, and it made me realize that maybe I should start paying a bit more attention to my surroundings when I'm out and about, and start looking for some of the signs that I had started to learn about. So after I had heard that story from Brother Remington, I told myself, you know what? I gotta see one of these things, or at least I gotta try. I gotta get out into the places where I feel like they could be. It could be. And that's what episode 3 is going to be all about. A few stories about my own personal encounters with the unknown in the wilderness.
Thanks for listening to the BLC. Be sure to subscribe and share. And it would be really awesome if you'd be willing to take just a minute to give us a review, as that helps this show out a ton.